Hi everyone, Mike here at Bikes by Mike for another cycling related video. Today I'm back in the garage to do some bike maintenance. And today I'm going to remove and install new frame bearings in this bike here, which is Cannondale Habit. I think it's a 2018 version, about 3 years old. It's not my bike, so I'm not sure. Next to wheel building and shock overhaul, I would say that replacing frame bearings or any bearings on a bike is probably the most challenging bike maintenance task for any home mechanic. So not something I would suggest you start off with if you haven't done much bike maintenance, but if you're a seasoned home mechanic, then give it a try. I was hesitant to work on bearings on my bike for a very long time, mainly because if you do it really badly, you could permanently damage your frame, which is probably the worst thing you could probably do to your bike. So the way you remove and install the bearings is really important, and you do need to know what you're doing. And most importantly, and I'll make this point a bit later, you need to use the right tools. That will ensure that you remove them and install them correctly in perfect alignment and to ensure you don't damage your frame. So this won't be a step-by-step guide on how to replace every single frame bearing on your bike. Once you've done one bearing, the process to replace the others may be slightly different, but essentially it's pretty much the same. Also, the bike design amongst bike manufacturers varies quite a bit. So the actual linkage points, bearing sizes, and the overall process for how you install and remove bearings will change. But what you see here will be very similar to the technique you'll have to use on your bike. So this video is really about just highlighting some of the key tips and tricks to successfully install and remove frame bearings and ensure you get the most life out of those new frame bearings. So first, why do you have to replace frame bearings? Since a lot of people never do replace them. And I would say if you want a bike that runs buttery smooth, like a new bike feels the first time you take it out for a ride, replace the bearings. That's why new bikes feel different than older bikes, is because the bearings are moving much more freely. And if you don't replace your bearings, they will eventually fail and potentially seize, which not only will make your ride feel horrible, but the seizing of bearings could transfer all the force that those bearings would normally try to dissipate into the frame and could actually damage or even crack your frame. Okay, so let's start with the tools you're going to need for the job. Now, to access the frame pivot bearings and the linkage points, you're most likely going to have to remove your crank. So you will need one of these, which is a pedal wrench. This, I believe, is 8 millimeters, but check the size of yours. It may be 7 or 9 as well. So you can use that. I actually much prefer using this, which is a breaker bar, often used to loosen bolts on car wheels. So it's a strong bar, has lots of leverage, and you can put socket attachments on the end. So if you get a socket set, you can get one for your crank. Mine's an 8 millimeter, attach it onto there, and then you can remove your cranks. It makes it a lot easier. The cranks are notoriously difficult to get off because of the pedal forces, they just seem to tighten over time. So I like using a breaker bar. And in that vein, it's not necessary, but to grab the opposite pedal arm as you're loosening your crank, it's good again to get some leverage. Now this is a bit of overkill, but this is a tube straightening tool. And I use this to grab the other pedal arm. It's also referred to as a frame straightening tool, but it has actually a lot of uses where you need leverage to be able to loosen various bolts. So that is extremely handy if you have it. A set of bungee cords is useful to dangle the linkage points off your frame as you're removing bolts. Shop rags or paper towels. A set of gloves just keeps your hands clean. You're definitely going to need some Allen keys, either a full set, or for me, I'll probably get away with a 6 and 5 mil Allen key and a 25 torque wrench. And you'll need some bearing prep. Synthetic grease or bearing grease, such as this, but there's a lot on the market, as well as a medium strength thread locker, such as Loctite Blue. So two tools that I think are must-have to do this job easily, safely, and to limit any chance you're going to damage your frame is a bearing press and a bearing puller. Now this is a bearing press. I actually have two here. And this is a larger one that I use for bottom brackets and wheel bearings. And this is actually a smaller frame-specific bearing press, which is surprisingly difficult to find. But I found this one in Canada, and it's actually really handy to get into the small spaces that you need to press in bearings on a frame. And essentially, both of them work the same way. You have two ends, and you screw the spindle into one, and then you add drifts. Now, these drifts come in different sizes to match the bearing size that you're trying to work with. And you can see that essentially these two drifts fit into the bearing, and as you turn this, it actually presses those drifts together, which presses the bearings together. And what it does so well that hacks don't do well is that it pushes them in with a consistent force and in perfect alignment. So the problem with putting bearings into a frame or any housing is that it could be misaligned. So you want it perfectly aligned so it doesn't damage its seated housing as you're pressing it in. To remove bearings, you can sometimes use a press, but I almost always like to use a blind bearing puller, such as this. And similar to the bearing press, the puller allows you to attach different attachments on here to match the size of the bearing. And then this part fits into the inside race of the bearing, and you essentially just force it or whack the bearing out, and it removes it quite easily and safely. Again, making sure not to damage the seated position of the bearing as it's being removed. And lastly, you'll need obviously your new bearings. So I have my bearings here that I'll need. In this case, I actually bought them individually, but I strongly recommend you buy frame bearing sets from the manufacturer. They're going to include all the bearings you need to replace every frame bearing, and then you don't have to individually source each bearing. So that's pretty much it for the tools you're going to need for the job. Let's get started. So there you go. That's how you replace frame bearings on your mountain bike. Not the easiest bike maintenance project by any means, but definitely doable if you take your time, use the right tools, and refer to the owner's manual. So now, here are my tips and tricks for the installation and removal of frame bearings and for getting the most life out of your new bearings. Number 1, use the correct tools for the job. I strongly suggest not using hacks. Those that are tempted to grab a socket set and hammer and to pound out the bearings, just don't go there. You've had your warning. The 3 most important tools are number 1, a frame-specific bearing press, number 2, a blind bearing puller, and lastly, a torque wrench to tighten all linkage bolts to manufacturer's specifications. Number 2, do it slowly, do it cautiously, or don't do it at all. As I mentioned earlier, next to wheel building and the shock overhaul, replacing bearings is the most challenging maintenance task for a bike mechanic, especially a home mechanic. And unlike the first 2, if you mess it up, you could do permanent damage to your frame. This is not the time to rush things or cut corners. Number 3, refer to your owner's manual for specific instructions on bearing preparation, installation removal, and bolt torque settings. Usually there's a separate supplementary owner's manual that has this information. Instruction between bike manufacturers and bikes varies quite a bit, so this is the one of the few times where it's absolutely necessary to check the instructions manual. And lastly, number 4, buy frame bearings as a complete set from bike manufacturer. I always recommend buying high quality Japanese bearings for bottom brackets and wheels, but for frame bearings, including headsets, you're fine to go with slightly lower quality bearings. You can almost always buy frame bearings as a complete set. It'll save you time in that you won't have to source out and spec out every single bearing, and buying them as a set will be cheaper than buying them individually. That's all I got for today, folks. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you're not a subscriber to my channel, please subscribe. It gives me an opportunity to create more great content for all of you. Happy rolling, everyone. See you next time.